Chapter 11. Prisoner. On a small rise in the middle of Salisbury Plain in southern England stood a formidable castle protected by a double row of walls and a wide, deep moat. Within its thick-walled central tower, Eleanor was left to muse upon her past and wonder about her future. She was not treated like an ordinary criminal, locked in a cell, but was free to move about the castle and its courtyard. As a royal prisoner, she was what we might call under house arrest, but she was always well guarded and had no chance of escape. She, who had helped shape world events, now had to rely on her guards for news of the world. She, who had been the magnet of poets and writers, the patroness of art and learning, was now cut off from friends and family and all that she had loved. While Eleanor adjusted to her new life, Henry was busy stamping out the last fires of rebellion. With his clever military tactics, his incredible speed, and his prompt punishment of the rebels, he soon had all his lands once more under control. Recognized as Lord of Ireland, King of England, Duke and Count of his various continental lands, he seemed to be more powerful than ever. Now he could turn his attention to the Queen. What to do with his difficult wife, he didn't quite know. She was out of harm's way for the moment, but he knew that she would soon be the object of intrigues, the inspiration for plots and conspiracies. Already one of her Aquitanian admirers had written, "Return, O captive, if you can. The King of the North holds you in captivity, but do not despair. Lift your voice like a trumpet, and it shall reach the ears of your sons. The day will come when they will set you free, and you shall come again to dwell in your native land." Henry wanted to divorce Eleanor, but that would be repeating Louis's blunder, and he would lose his biggest and richest domain, Aquitaine. He then thought of putting her into a nunnery. He knew the perfect place, the Abbey of Fontrevolt, where some of Eleanor's forebears had ended their days, and which Eleanor had long supported. He knew that Eleanor approved of this most unusual abbey, which housed monks as well as nuns, and yet had always been run by a woman, an abbess. Henry thought he would arrange to have Eleanor made abbess of Fontrevolt. That seemed the best solution. But Eleanor would have none of it. At 53, she had no desire to retire to a cloistered life, which she knew would end any hope of future freedom. She appealed to an archbishop who agreed with Eleanor that the religious life was not for her. He knew as well as Eleanor, and as Henry should have too, that the black headdress of an abbess would not sit on Eleanor's head as becomingly as a queen's crown, and so Henry left her in Salisbury Castle for the moment. But the moment dragged into years, 15 long years. During all this time, Eleanor kept up her courage and her hope, and she learned something that did not come naturally to her: patience. Eleanor had been in prison 2 years when she was allowed, under guard, of course, to visit her youngest daughter, Joanna, in Winchester Castle. Eleanor helped 11-year-old Joanna pack her belongings in preparation for her long trip south to meet her future husband, King William of Sicily. Eleanor was back in the confinement of Salisbury Castle when Henry's mistress, fair Rosamond, died of tuberculosis. Though Rosamond had died a natural death while Eleanor was still a well-guarded prisoner, malicious gossipers would delight in far-fetched tales that the Queen had poisoned her. More important to the feudal world was the death of Eleanor's first husband, Louis, in 1180. The timid king was highly praised for his piety, his good works, and his gentleness. As one devoted chronicler pointed out, his French royal banners bore white lilies, not the fierce lions or leopards the Plantagenets liked to display. But Louis's successor, 16-year-old Philip, was made of sterner stuff. Would he be a hammer to the English, as the French had predicted at his birth? Henry would soon find out. In the meantime, he was in despair about his sons. In Winchester Castle there was a strange wall painting of a huge eagle beset by 4 little eaglets who were pecking and clawing at the eagle's eyes and wings. Henry explained to a friend that the eagle was himself, the eaglets his sons. He added, "Thus will they pursue me until I die." The devil's streak in Henry was showing more and more in his sons. They continued to plot against their father or to fight amongst themselves. Young Henry became insanely jealous of Richard, who far surpassed him in skill at arms and military leadership. When King Henry tried to interest the prince in the arts of ruling, still never giving him any real authority, it was too late. Young Henry was not interested. He wanted the rewards of royalty, but none of the hard work his father and mother had so eagerly and ably undertaken. Spoiled and restless, he longed to leave England for the more exciting life in Aquitaine, where tournaments and romance beckoned. Once back in the turbulent South, he was teased and taunted as the lord of little land, a crowned prince without lands to rule or revenues to collect. Spoiling for a fight, his friends did their best to inflame him and to stir up his resentment not only against his father but also against his brothers. When he had squandered all his money, he and some of his disreputable companions went on a plundering spree, looting churches and shrines of gold and silver treasures, terrorizing the countryside. Perhaps he felt this was one way to draw attention to himself. On this, at last, wild adventure, he fell ill with dysentery, so often fatal in those days. Soon he lay dying, tended by his faithful friend William Marshall. He confessed his sins and asked for his father's forgiveness. Even the most hardened sinners become humble and contrite when faced with death. Prince Henry also begged his father to show mercy to his mother, held so long in captivity. A church deacon was sent to the Salisbury castle to break the news to Eleanor, but Eleanor spoke first, saying that she already knew his message. Her son was dead. She had had a dream of her fair son lying on a couch wearing 2 crowns, one on top of the other. One was his solid gold earthly crown, the other was composed of unearthly light and shone with the brilliance of the Holy Grail. Eleanor explained to the astonished deacon that the crown of the celestial light signified everlasting bliss, that her son had been forgiven and had risen to heaven. The popular prince was widely mourned. People forgot his weaknesses and remembered only his beauty, his generosity, and his charm. It was probably due to the prince's dying request that Eleanor was allowed more freedom for a while. She visited her oldest daughter, Matilda, back from Germany, staying with her all through the winter, and was with her at the birth of a son. At about this time, Eleanor received 2 unexpected gifts from King Henry, a lovely scarlet robe lined with miniver and a saddle trimmed with gold. Then Henry invited Eleanor to Windsor Castle for Christmas. This was to be both a family gathering and a business meeting to settle once again their son's inheritance. Prince Henry's sudden death called for a redistribution of lands among their sons. Eleanor was now 62 and had been in captivity 10 years. Though her hair was graying and her laughing eyes had grown more serious, she was still a lovely woman who moved with grace and dignity. Her mind was as sharp as ever, and she could still exert political influence. Henry had not aged so well and looked older than his 51 years. He had grown stout, and he limped from a wound inflicted by a horse. Always careless of his dress, he had become positively sloppy and unkempt. While Eleanor had become more serene, Henry had become more irascible, often acting more like a suspicious despot than the great ruler he had been. If Henry thought he could use his captive queen as a political pawn, he soon found out that her punishment had not made her any more docile. At the Christmas gathering, Eleanor realized that Henry expected her to use her influence on Richard to persuade him to go along with new arrangements for him and his brothers. The king wanted Eleanor to make Richard give up Aquitaine to his little brother John. One can imagine how Eleanor bristled at the idea of giving up Aquitaine, especially to little John, of all her sons the least promising. It was obvious that John had become Henry's favorite as Richard was hers. Both Eleanor and Richard suspected that Henry was laying the groundwork to bypass Richard, now the rightful heir to the English throne, in favor of John. Eleanor began to wonder if those fine presents, the fur-lined cloak and gilded saddle, were just bribes. But gifts or no gifts, she flatly refused to go along with Henry's plans. She pointed out to her husband that Aquitaine was not his to give, that she and Richard held it in their own right as vassals of the King of France. Eleanor was forceful enough to block Henry's schemes to juggle their son's inheritance. Not only did Richard and Geoffrey support her stand, the barons at the meeting also backed her. The meeting ended with bitter feelings, the king furious at Eleanor's political triumph and even more hostile to Richard than before. After this period of relative freedom, it was harder than ever for Eleanor to be sent back to Salisbury Castle to resume the monotony and dreary life of a prisoner. 3 months later, her son Joffrey was killed in a tournament. Thrown to the ground, he was trampled to death by galloping horses. Now only 2 of Eleanor's sons were left, her pride and joy, Richard, and Henry's darling, John. Eleanor knew that they would soon be battling for their inheritance. And battle they did, sometimes against each other, sometimes against their father, and nearly always with the aid of the new French King Philip. Philip was a far cry from his timid father Louis, and he lacked the charisma of Eleanor's sons. He was not much to look at, untidy in dress, with a shock of unkempt hair and one blind eye. Cold and calculating, he had one ambition, to break asunder the great Plantagenet stronghold on power and to win back bit by bit the lands he felt belonged to France. What Philip lacked in appeal, he made up in cleverness. He knew how to use the weaknesses of others for his own ends. He saw that he could play on Richard's fears and that his father meant to displace him with John. After he promised to back Richard, the two became close friends, plotting against King Henry. In 1187, news from the Holy Land interrupted the schemings and bickerings of the kings and princes of Europe. Jerusalem had been captured by the Muslim Sultan Saladin. The tomb of Christ and the true cross, the most sacred of all Christian relics, were now in the hands of the infidel dogs. The church cried out for a new crusade. Richard immediately signed up. King Henry and King Philip, somewhat reluctantly, soon followed suit. All promised to obey the truce of God, the church ban on local fighting while men prepared for the crusade. The truce of God did not last long. While Henry was in England, gathering men and equipment for the crusade, rebellion broke out again in Normandy. Before crossing the Channel to deal with it, Henry stopped in Salisbury. If he saw Eleanor, it was for the last time. As soon as so often in the past, a storm arose during his Channel crossing, blotting out his island kingdom and his captive queen in a tempest of wind and rain. Things were now coming to a showdown between Henry, Philip, and Richard. The crusade had to wait while the Christian kings settled their own petty quarrels. Convinced that his father meant to disinherit him, Richard had joined forces with the wily Philip. Many knights deserted Henry, thinking their future lay with Richard. Only a few friends remained loyal to the old king, now worn out and sick. His leg wound had festered, pain and fever spread through his body. It was clear that he did not have long to live. Despite his illness, he answered a last summons to parley with King Philip and Richard. He was so feeble that he could barely keep his seat astride his horse. Even the ungallant Philip was moved to offer him a cloak to sit on. But the old king scorned the offer. As was his custom, he would parley on horseback. But he was not prepared for Philip's harsh terms, that he give up all his continental lands to Richard and recognize him as heir to the throne of England. An ominous clap of thunder rent the air. Henry reeled in his saddle, but he mustered enough strength to whisper fiercely to his son, "God grant I may not die before I have my revenge on you." He was carried back to his castle at Chinon, where he soon lay dying. He asked to see the names of those who had deserted him. When he found that his beloved John was one, he turned his face to the wall, saying, "It is enough. I care no more for myself or for this world." And he could be heard muttering, "Shame, shame, shame on a conquered king."